We have a long, proud, yet volatile history of immigration in America. From heartwarming images of the Statue of Liberty leading to Ellis Island, to gut-wrenching images of the Hutto Family Detention Center in Texas, immigration is a powerful, politically charged issue. During the founding of America, we struggled with who should have the privilege to be here and who should have rights. Massachusetts sought believers but punished dissent. Virginia sought workers but found them in slaves. Pennsylvania sought citizens but cultivated them from foreign lands. Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania were each pro-immigration, but not necessarily pro-immigrant. To immigrate means to enter and settle in a country to which one is not native. To emigrate means to leave a country to settle in another. Welcome to Access News, a program that encourages us to think about what it means to be a good citizen. How can we, the people, become involved through civic engagement? On Access News today, we'll discuss immigration with renowned attorney and human rights champion, Professor Barbara Hines. You're watching Access News, hands-on news. Barbara Hines has received many awards, including 2 Fulbright scholarships. She has also been recognized for her excellence in teaching as well as a top litigation attorney. She is a clinical professor and co-director of the Immigration Clinic at the University of Texas in Austin. Her work exemplifies what civic engagement and civic responsibility is all about. Barbara, welcome to Access News.
Thank you for inviting me.
As a leader in immigration law, how has immigration changed over the last century?
Well, over the last century, our immigration laws have gotten more restrictive. However, we had no immigration restrictions before the early part of the 20th century. For many, the first immigration laws actually favored Europeans and didn't really allow for immigration of Asians at all. In 1965, our laws were liberalized really to promote sort of the notion of family unity and family reunification, and people from all over the world were able to come to the United States. But since 1996, which was the last major immigration reform, our laws have become very restrictive, making it more difficult for people to come to the United States.
What is it about the U.S. that draws immigrants?
Well, I think there are many wonderful things about our country. Our country has always been a melting pot, but I think we have really sort of a schizophrenic relationship because on the one hand, we do accept many, many immigrants through the United States. On the other hand, we have had a history of making people leave the United States. Asians after they built the railroads, Mexicans during the Depression and things of that sort. But really, our country is known for being a melting pot with great opportunities for immigrants that come to our countries.
You say that a lot of immigrants come to the U.S. With today's laws, has it become so strict that it's almost impossible for someone to move to America legally?
Well, our laws are very restrictive, and that is, I think, a good question. If you qualify under limited family categories, married to a United States citizen, have a child who's over the age of 21. I think it's important. There's a lot of discourse about how people just come to the United States to have children and then they can immigrate, but really you have to wait until your child is 21 years old before you could even file to get status in the United States. But there are very limited categories based on certain family relationships and based on employment. For the majority of people, workers in this country, people that are doing what I think jobs that many American citizens are unwilling to do, there's really no way for them to legally come to the United States. We don't have a process for workers generally to come to the United States.
I'm glad you mentioned the topic about related to workers. A lot of immigrants create revenue for the U.S. If that's true, then why do so many people oppose immigration?
Well, I think immigration is a very, very complicated issue, and I think unfortunately it's not just about immigration. I think sometimes when we talk about immigration, we're really talking about a demographic change in the United States. We do have many, many immigrants coming to the United States, primarily from Latin America and Asia, South Asia, and the complexion and the demographic makeup of our country is changing. And I think sometimes when you hear the sort of vitriolic discussion about immigrants, it's not just about immigration. It's also, I think, about race and what's happening in the United States, particularly in a time of economic insecurity and a recession. And we've seen this historically before. Anti-immigrant sentiment is generally at its highest in times of economic crises.
That's really interesting. I'd never realized that. That's really interesting. Do you feel that there's some discrimination, some role of discrimination for immigrants?
Particularly now, yes, because what I think is that we have a population of 10 million to 11 million undocumented workers who are our gardeners and our child care workers and the people taking care of our elderly parents. I do want to be clear that there are also many immigrants that are entrepreneurs, Silicon Valley, and what you had said created, great wealth to the United States. But I think when people sort of talk stereotypically about immigrants, they're talking about lower wage workers. But once again, these aren't jobs that Americans will take. And so we aren't going to be able to send all those people home. And so I do think the idea is maybe if you make their life so unpleasant, they're going to leave. But that really isn't going to happen. And if they did, I think it would be devastating for our economy.
Immigration is such a hot political topic right now. Do you think that we should be playing politics with the lives of people who are just searching for a better life?
No, I really don't. And I think that it has become such a divisive political issue, unfortunately, like many issues today in our political scene. But basically, I think that we do have to figure out what we're going to do with the people that have been here for a really long time, who are part of our community, who have children that are born here. And doing nothing is not an acceptable solution.
Definitely on that part, I agree with you. I'd like to move on to a segment with Don Miller, who will talk to us a little bit about our government, and then we'll continue our conversation with you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tamara. Hi, I'm Don Miller. The United States Constitution would have never been approved were it not for the promise of a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is the collective name for the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, which limit the power of the U.S. government. These limitations protect our natural rights of liberty and property, including freedoms of religion, speech, free press, free assembly, as well as the right to keep and bear arms. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, introduced the Bill of Rights to the first U.S. Congress in 1789. 10 of the 12 amendments he proposed were accepted as constitutional amendments 2 years later. Discussed and debated every day, our Bill of Rights influences the court of public opinion and our legal system. The Bill of Rights are vital in both our law and our government. Learning about our rights helps make us more informed citizens. Let's watch.
When the Founding Fathers met here in Philadelphia's Independence Hall to create a new federal government for the United States, all the delegates understood that such a step was necessary. But how much power that government should have was much debated. Having won a war which gave them freedom, the right to own property, and the right of self-government, the question remained, what could they do to ensure that each successive generation of Americans would also have those same rights and freedoms? They wanted the rights of the people protected. They wanted these rights, such as the free exercise of religion, freedom of speech and press, and protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, written down and made part of the nation's governing document. As stated in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Anti-Federalists insisted upon a Declaration of Rights that derived not from government, but instead were the natural rights of all the people independent of the government. To satisfy these concerns and ensure ratification of the new Constitution, a Bill of Rights, a Declaration of Human Rights, or as they are now called, fundamental civil rights, was promised. In the summer of 1788, a proposed draft of the Bill of Rights was circulated among the states. Many of these fundamental rights derived from abuses of power that the colonists suffered under oppressive British rule. In 1690, the first colonial newspaper, Boston's Public Occurrences, was suppressed after one issue. In 1760, Founding Father James Otis argued against illegal searches conducted by British soldiers. From 1765 throughout the Revolutionary War, colonists were forced against their will to house these same soldiers in their homes. In 1775, British troops marched on Lexington and Concord to confiscate colonial arms and ammunition. British authorities did not always allow colonists the same rights of due process or speedy trials that Englishmen were guaranteed. And colonists faced excessive bails and cruel and unusual punishments. With the proposed Bill of Rights, most of the Anti-Federalists were satisfied that the people's fundamental rights would be safeguarded. Since their adoption, these amendments have done their job. Americans in the 21st century still have as much freedom and as many rights, perhaps even more, than the Founding Fathers.
Anti-Federalists opposed a large and strong federal government in favor of individual and powerful states' rights. Even today, we debate and discuss the balance of power between the states and the federal government. If it weren't for the Anti-Federalists like Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, we would not have the Bill of Rights and as much individual freedom as we do now. Anti-Federalists were also concerned that the new position of president might evolve into a king-like abuse of power. Do you think the President of the United States today has too much power? Share your opinions. Join the discussion at our website, accessnews.us. That's .us for United States. What do you think? For Access News, I'm Don Miller.
Thank you, Don. We have with us Barbara Hines on Access News, who is an expert on immigration. Barbara, I'd like to ask, how can immigration laws improve? You support the DREAM Act. Can you tell us a little bit more about that act?
Yes, the DREAM Act, which is the acronym for the law, would provide legal status for students who came to the United States before they were 16 and who have finished college or have completed 2 years of college initially and then later finish or serve in the military. And I think that's really a good example of who many of our immigrants are. These are the valedictorians of high schools. These are the future doctors. These are the future teachers. And these are students who consider themselves that the United States is their home. As I was saying earlier, many of the immigrants have been here so long, they don't really know their home countries. They consider this their home. And I think of all the deserving immigrants out there, really, the dreamers, the university students, the students that have so much to contribute to our country really deserve legal status in this country. Unfortunately, because of the political situation, this bill has not been able to pass. It's been introduced for the last 10 years.
I think that's a perfect segue to what you mentioned earlier about doing nothing. It's really something that we can do. So speaking of making changes, you recently were involved with a lawsuit against the Hutto Family Detention Center. Can you tell us what happened there? What did you see there that was so alarming?
Well, as part of the immigration policy that we've seen over the last 10 years, it has been focused only on enforcement. That is, to arrest more people, to deport more people, to make the lives of immigrants more difficult. And the T-done without any legalization or any means for the immigrant population to legalize their status here. So the Don Hutto facility, which was opened up in Taylor, Texas, a former medium security prison, was part of an enforcement-only strategy. And what the Bush administration decided to do was to incarcerate parents who were found in the United States, either coming into the United States without documents or who were found any place in the United States with their children, not United States citizens, children who were born abroad. They were detained, imprisoned in prison conditions in a former medium security prison, living in cells, dressed in prison uniforms, subjected to all the rules that a prison would have. Children were not allowed toys. They were not allowed to have any writing utensils in their cells. There was no medical care. It was horrendous.
What kind of changes have happened since the lawsuit? How has that detention center improved?
Well, my clinic at the law school with a private law firm and the local and national American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit challenging the conditions at Hutto. We reached a settlement with the government which vastly improved the conditions, but you can't always achieve what you want through litigation. We had many, many strategies. We had a very vibrant advocacy effort by the community. We had national advocacy. We had, we challenged these conditions under international human rights strategies, but we did settle the case. We had a 2-year settlement that was about to expire, and we had already taken the position that we were going to litigate again after the expiration of the settlement, but the Obama administration made a decision to close the facility and close the facility for children. Children are no longer detained at Hutto. Women are there, but fortunately children are no longer detained generally in the United States. There's one facility in Pennsylvania which has 200 beds, but the facility in Texas no longer operates to house children.
How do you feel about the settlement itself?
Well, what I'm most happy about is that the facility is closed for children. It was a difficult decision for me as a lawyer. I teach, so I tried to teach my students that litigation is not the only mechanism for advocacy. So the settlement vastly improved the lives of the children there, but at the end of the day, children were still housed in a former medium security prison, even though the conditions were better.
So when you say that's not the only way to advocate, what are other ways of making changes?
I think organizing politically. I think the Dreamers are a good example. They have organized, they have lobbied, they have organized protests, they have had marches, using international organizations to write reports. For example, the Women's Commission on Refugee Children, Amnesty International, the United Nations were involved in criticism of Hutto. And so I think really in today's climate, you have to be very creative and think of as many different ways as you possibly can for advocacy. But I think engaging in our political process with all of its limitations and divisiveness today is really important.
Corrections Corporation of America privately owned Hutto. What are the differences in privately versus public facilities and how they're held accountable?
So the Corrections Corporation of America is one of the largest for-profit prison companies in the United States. There has been a big move to privatize both immigration detention facilities as well as federal and local prisons. The problem with a for-profit outfit is that their motive is to make more money. And in fact, in the Hutto litigation, the Corrections Corporation of America obviously wanted to maximize its profits. And so that does not lead to a good situation for immigrants who are detained there. In addition, there are limitations in litigation when you're litigating against a private corporation as opposed to a federal entity. And in the Hutto litigation, there were questions about who was responsible for the conditions. Was it the federal government saying, well, it's not our fault, it's really because we've delegated this to the Corrections Corporation of America? And so it makes it a much less transparent situation, in my opinion.
It's true. Okay, so in closing, what would you like for us, the audience, to understand about immigration?
Well, I would like to think that we are a country of immigrants, that immigrants have made great contributions to our society, that all of us, perhaps other than the Native Americans, at one point were immigrants, and that really immigration, we need to have some kind of immigration reform. We have to have a way that hardworking immigrants do not have to risk their lives in the desert coming here to work for jobs that are available, and that we need to go back to our welcoming roots as a country of immigrants.
Thank you, Barbara, for being with us here today on Access News. You can learn more about Barbara's work at the University of Texas website, utexas.edu, and at our website, accessnews.us. You can ask questions, share your comments and opinions. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. One beautiful thing about America is that we, the people, have power. The more we know, the better decisions we can make. For Access News, I'm Tamara, and that's Austin.
Executive producers Devorah Ben-Moshe, Ken Hurley. With funding from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation through the Knight Community Information Challenge. Supported by the Austin Community Foundation, fostering philanthropy in Austin for 35 years. The Austin Community Foundation, for now and forever. Created and written by Devorah Ben-Moshe, Ken Hurley. Hosted by Tamara Suiter-Ocuto. Interpreter for Tamara Suiter-Ocuto, Jennifer Stoker. Segment host for A More Perfect Union, Don Miller. Voicing for Don Miller, Ken Hurley. Crew: producer Linda Latowski, director-editor Orlando Lopez, 3D animation Doug Gray, technical director Carla Sadenia, director of photography Brian Blake, assistant to the producer Susan Harper, original music Aaron Jake, camera Doug Gray, Tim O'Neill, Ross Wilsey, production sound mixer Rod Simonson, teleprompter operator Brandon Taj Mora. Additional crew: photographers Eve Granick, Devore Ben-Moshe, intern Brandon Taj Mora, additional interpreters Jacob Stacy, Tracy Hughley, Jessica Graves. Website developed by Electric Leaf, Jonathan Braden. Closed captioning provided by CPC, closed captioning and subtitle services. Civic education video segments provided by Ambrose Video Publishing. Special thanks to Susan Mernant, Lisa Williams, Mary Ben Ramsey, Monica Williams, Janice Kelklar, Paula Lang, Jeff Garvey. Claire Bugan, Bobby Guerrera, Russell Harvard, Cynthia Foss, Bill Stotesbury, Caitlin Mack, Yitzhak Ben-Moshe, Bobby Nord, Kenneth Gladish.